Good morning. Today we are continuing our chapter 10 in our religion books about the prophets in the Bible. Last time we read about the non-writing prophets who don't have books named after them that they wrote. Today we're going to be learning about the classical prophets. So we're going to read about two specific classical prophets today. So we are on page 113. We are doing parts 1 and part 2 of the classical prophets. So we're going to be filling in the blanks for part 1 and part 2. So you can follow along with your reading guide as we do the reading to fill in the blanks. Page 113. In the Old Testament, the words and actions of 16 prophets are recorded in 16 books named after them. These prophets are sometimes called the classical prophets or the writing prophets. Let's look at one minor prophet, Amos, and one major prophet, Ezekiel. So we call them major and minor prophets for reasons. The books of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel are quite long. So these prophets are called the major prophets because they have big books in the Bible. The other prophets whose books are shorter are called the minor prophets. These labels do not mean that the major prophets are more important than the minor prophets. They only describe the books of the prophets. The length of the books. So the three are called major prophets because they have big books. The minor prophets have small books. They're all equally important because they're prophets. They're passing on that messages from God. Any message from God is important. So Amos was the first of the classical prophets. He prophesied, hopefully we're following along. Who was the first of the classical? So we should have already answered number 1. You should have number 2 answered because I just read it. Amos was the first of the classical prophets. He prophesied in Israel almost 800 years before the birth of Christ. We know little about the life of Amos. He was not a full-time prophet. Rather, he was a shepherd and a tree pruner. So hopefully you're following along. Do you have a reading guide, Anthony?
Yes, we do.
Okay. Are you filling it in?
Yeah.
Okay. So you've got 1, 2, and 3 filled in already? Okay. God called him from his simple life to challenge the injustice in Israelite society. During this time, some very wealthy people lived in Israel, but so did some very poor people. The injustice went against God's covenant with his chosen people. Amos was a clever preacher. In chapter 1 of the book of Amos, we read how he condemned the sinfulness of foreign nations. So his listeners might have been thinking, oh, good, he's not talking about us, because he's talking about foreign nations, other countries. But by chapter 2, we can see that Amos began to condemn the sins of the people of Israel. He did not hold back at all. The Lord says, the people of Israel have sinned again and again, and for this I will certainly punish them. They sell into slavery honest people who cannot pay their debts, the poor who cannot repay even the price of a pair of sandals. They trample down the weak and helpless and push the poor out of the way. That's from verses 6 and 7. As terrible as the sins of the other nations were, God considered the sins of Israel even worse because they had the advantage of their covenant relationship with him. Amos continued his prophecies, predicting the destruction of Israel. His words were mostly words of condemnation and doom. I'll read that one more time. His words were mostly words of condemnation and doom. But his book concludes with hope-filled words, saying that God would rebuild the nation after its destruction. That's from Amos chapter 9, verses 11 to 15. Then now there's Ezekiel. Ezekiel lived about 200 years after Amos. I'll read that one more time. Ezekiel lived about 200 years after Amos. He was a priest in the very first group of people taken in Babylon during the exile. He did all of his prophesying. He did all of his prophesying from this foreign country. So where was he taken to? Where was he taken to? I read it in the sentence before, Landon. He was a priest in the very first group of people taken to Babylon during the exile. He did all of his prophesying from this foreign country. So you need to know what that foreign country is. He was taken to Babylon. Yes?
But how does that fit in the sentence?
Yeah.
Ezekiel did all of his prophesying from it does say from
Wouldn't it be foreign country?
I'm a foreign country.
Oh, good catch. Let's double check on that one. It does say the word there, so that is a little confusing. Oh, so I would accept if you crossed off the A and you put Babylon, I'd also accept foreign country. Okay, so both would work. Jerusalem and the temple had not yet been destroyed, so Ezekiel's early preaching was a warning that the final end of the kingdom was coming. To get his point across, God had Ezekiel perform symbolic acts. So God had Ezekiel perform symbolic acts. Ezekiel had to lay on his side for 430 days to symbolize the number of years the people of Israel and Judah would be punished. So he's laying on his side. How many days are in 1 year? Somebody say it.
365.
365. And he had to lay on his side for 430 days. So that's like well over a year. That's like a year and 3 months. So he's laying on his side that long just to prove his point that that's how long in years they're going to be punished. He had to bake his food on cow dung.
What is that?
Cow dung is the cow manure.
Oh.
To symbolize that the Israelites would eat unclean food during the exile. He even had to cut off all the hair on his head and then burn a third of it, chop up a third of it, and scatter a third in the wind. This symbolized how the chosen people would be killed and scattered by the Babylonians. The book of Ezekiel isn't all doom and gloom, though. The last third of the book contains many hopeful prophecies that God would rescue his people after their punishment. Ezekiel described God as the good shepherd who would rescue his sheep after the destruction. That's talked about in Ezekiel chapter 34, verses 11 to 31. In another famous prophecy, Ezekiel saw dry bones coming back to life. So even though he had a lot of doom and gloom, all his horrible stuff's going to happen, he's saying, you know what? God's going to come and he's going to help you after that. He will be there for you still. So God said to me, mortal man, the people of Israel are like these bones. They say that they are dried up without any hope and with no future. When I open the graves where my people are buried and bring them out, they will know that I am the Lord. I will put my breath in them and bring them back to life and let them live in their own land. Then they will know that I am the Lord. From chapter 37, verse 11, 13 to 14. As a priest, Ezekiel was very interested in the temple in Jerusalem. The last chapters of his book describe a vision that the temple will be rebuilt. Because the temple is a symbol of God's presence with his chosen people, this vision is a promise that God has not abandoned his people. So even though the people were making very bad choices, even though there were consequences for those bad choices, they were put into exile into Babylon. They were killed and scattered by the Babylonians. Bad things were going to happen to them, but God would still be there. He would not leave them, and he would be there for them always. So even in the bad times, God is with you. So we're going to finish filling in the blanks. Fill in those blanks for the Classical Prophets Part 1 and 2 about Amos and Ezekiel. To my friends at home, we hope you are well, and we hope to see you soon.